I have a lot of reading to do. Good morning to everyone. 26 February, and we're already to the end of the second month of this year. It goes faster all the time. Quick review, after I show you that slide, which always comes up every time. The last time we finished up looking at the Persian period. We had already talked about the Samaritans and Gerizim and the synagogues. And the last time we talked about an actual murder, that's what everybody calls it, but I think it was just a death in the temple. It was a killing, an argument between two men, one of whom was the high priest, his name was John, and the other one whose name was Jesus, who was trying to take his place. They argued in the temple, and John actually killed his brother in the temple. So that's considered a major event during that time. Then we talked about Elephantine, the colony of Jews that lived in Egypt for a long time on an island in the Nile River. And I wanted to point out to you that, I had been saying, this you knew anyway, that a lot of the Jews did not go back to Jerusalem when they were released by Cyrus. Some of them left as soon as the attacks began with Nebuchadnezzar. And I was reading this week and came upon this passage in 2 Kings, chapter 25, verse 25. After the city has been destroyed, after Nebuchadnezzar has named a governor for the region, the people don't like him. And here's what it says in 25. In the 7th month, Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, son of Elishama of the royal family, came with 10 men and struck down Gedaliah and put him to death along with the Jews and the Chaldeans who were with him at Mizpah. Here's the important part. Then all the people, both small and great, and the captains of the forces arose and went to Egypt, for they were afraid of the Chaldeans. Egypt has a long history, does it not, with the Israelites. Joseph was a slave in Egypt. Jeremiah, when he was prophesying, was taken to Egypt against his will. Where did Joseph and Mary go when Jesus, the baby, was in danger? They went to Egypt. Where was Apollos from? He was from Egypt. What city? Alexandria. It was sort of like the favored place for them to go when there were problems. And probably this colony at Elephantine had something to do with that, the fact that there were people there of their own kind, and they maybe attracted some people from Israel when there were problems. Okay, so this group at Elephantine worshipped Yahu or Yahweh, corruption of the name Jehovah, of course, or Yahweh, but they also worshipped all the Egyptian gods at the same time. They were not monotheistic. Then their temple was destroyed by the priests of some other Egyptian gods, and that took care of the group at Elephantine. Then we got into the Greek period, and we talked about how the Greeks rose, especially after some major battles. We talked about Marathon, and I told you about, the story about the soldier who ran from Marathon all the way to Athens, and that's the distance for the marathon, more or less, these days. And he died after he got there. He ran so hard he just fell over and died. I gave you his name. I didn't give you his name. His name was Pheidippides. And I know what his last name was. It was Duda. Pheidippides Duda. And that, my friends, is the last corny joke you're going to get today. I don't know, unless we get to another one, which we might have down the way. Then there was another battle at Salamis against the Athenians in Persia, and that's where Persia decided they're not going to be able to take care of these Greeks that are rising. So the Greeks rose, but they couldn't get along amongst themselves, and so Philip of Macedon kind of imposed his will upon the Greeks, came down with a massive army, subdued them, and took over and kind of united them against Persia. And he was getting ready to go in and invade Persia when he was assassinated in 336 BC. He was only 46 years old. And so his son Alexander comes in. Alexander, as we're going to see this morning, we're going to look at a lot of things about Alexander, was an incredible person. But he had this big problem that we talked about last time, and that was drink. He drank a lot. Apparently, he didn't need an excuse to drink. After his victories, he drank. Of course, all of his battles were victories. This guy never lost a battle all the way across the distance we're going to look at this morning. So he was 20 years old, and he took over the Greek army, and he was going to invade, and he did invade all of Asia. Okay, let's talk about some of his exploits. Alexander grew up under Philip of Macedon. Philip of Macedon was a soldier, a king's soldier, and Alexander observed things that his father taught him about battles, and he participated in a couple of the battles with his father, learning about tactics, military tactics in battle. As a youth, he also watched the exploits of this guy, Epaminondas, who was a Theban general, probably the most famous general of antiquity. He invented and implemented this phalanges type of warfare. He could get as many as 265 soldiers in this tight body. If you see that coming at you with those big long spears that were 14 feet long, there was not a whole lot you could do against that. This guy invented that system. The Romans adapted it a little bit. They used it more for defensive, but it was the same idea. So Alexander grew up in a military context, learning military ideas, and he was already a genius, so that was going to work out pretty well for him. He studied under Aristotle. One of the French authors I consulted says he was a philosopher whose thoughts exerted a decisive influence on Western culture and whose writings and teachings encompass the entire range of the knowledge of the period. That is an understatement, really. This guy, he was called, let me just read a few of these. He was called the father of logic, the father of biology, the father of political science, the father of zoology, the father of embryology, the father of natural law, scientific method, rhetoric, psychology, realism, criticism, individualism, meteorology, and so forth. And this is the guy that taught Alexander when he was a youngster. So that would have influenced him quite a bit. These are the subjects that he learned under Aristotle. There's one that's really, when you look at that list, there's one that's missing that's going to be important for Alexander later on, and that's the idea of geography. Alexander knew what was in the known world. He obviously didn't know what was in the unknown world. He didn't know anything about China. And Alexander ran into India and China. He was coming up on China when his army quit fighting. We'll talk about that. But Aristotle had not prepared him for what he was going to meet in the East. And that was part of the reason why his army finally turned around. Here was his dream. I thought I had showed you this in the introduction, but I looked at my introduction and didn't see it. So maybe you've seen this screen, maybe not. I want us to notice the word one. Alexander's dream was to bring everything on all the earth under one obedience, one rule, one state, to reduce all populations to one single people, bringing them all under one law, shining upon all one single duty, like one common light. That's Plutarch. Did he get that done? He pretty much did over the next 10 years while he was fighting and trying to unite the world under his rule. He conquered the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, and Middle East, and parts of Asia. So we're going to look at that map that shows his progression. Started up here in Greece, came into what we call Middle East, and then down through Syria, right through Judea, and he stopped in Jerusalem. We're going to talk about that. And then he went into Egypt, conquered Egypt, came back up, and he defeated Darius III in the battle at Issus. Darius III was the one, remember, that we talked about who avoided being poisoned by Bagoas, who was poisoning all the Artaxerxes. Darius III was a sharp guy. He was a strong guy. He was a soldier. But Alexander was too much for him. His army was too much for Darius's army. And his army knew that. And so at the Battle of Issus, Alexander came upon the tent where Darius III was, and he was dead. He had not been killed by Alexander's men, but by his own men. And Alexander, the story goes, wept over Darius's body, telling him, I didn't want it to end like this. I considered you a worthy adversary. I would have treated you well. As a matter of fact, he had already captured Darius's wife, his mother, and his sister. But he would not use them as hostages. He could have, would not use them as hostages. He treated them as royalty. And he wanted to do the same for Darius III. He wanted to capture that man and treat him royally. But he didn't get the chance because Darius's own men killed him. And so Alexander had essentially defeated the Persian royalty at this point. Oops, sorry. I'm going the wrong way. Okay, pointer, here. Then he went, this pretty well describes his exploits, all the way across here, went up here into the northern part of Persia, and then he looped around, and here's where he stopped. Notice the name of that city there, Bucephala. We'll be back to that. And at Bucephala, then, his troops said, we're done. And so they came back all the way down back to Damascus. When they got down here, a lot of them went over here and built ships and floated up here on boats. He had a large army, and it was hard to keep all of his army together when he was traveling. Okay, yeah, I should show you this. So there's that area today. It's essentially the same area as the Persian Empire, with the addition, I guess, of some parts of Egypt. His geographical goal was to get all the way to what he called Ocean, which is a river that he imagined that encircled the known inhabited cosmos. But when he got over there near India and up against China, one of my references says his teacher as a boy, Aristotle, had failed to tell him about China as he didn't know himself. If he had gotten into China, he would have run into, I forget what dynasty it was, that was rising very powerfully, and he probably might have been defeated if he'd gone any farther. And on top of which, his army was really tired at that point. They'd been 10 years fighting all the way across this Persian area, and they hadn't lost a battle, at least not a major one, but they had worked really hard, and a lot of stuff had gone wrong in some ways, and so they had lost a lot of people. Here is a fuzzy picture, but there's essentially the size of that empire compared to the United States. Now remember, there were no phones, there were no computers, there were no satellites, there were no quick communications. Everything was done on horseback. But he went from one end to the other in 10 years, leading a very strong army, and he was quite effective in his advance. What he wanted to do was to go back to Greece, rebuild his army, and then he wanted to go into Britain. And then he wanted to go into Spain. Well, Spain first, then Britain, then Gaul, France. Then he wanted to come back and he wanted to go down into Africa. This guy had all kinds, he wanted to be a world power, even those worlds that hadn't been really developed yet. But it was not to be. On his way back from India, he stopped at Susa, then at Babylon, and there he died. He was only 32 years old. He was at the height of his power, but he was dead. So it didn't do him a lot of good, did it, to be at the height of his power. All the historians try to discover what he died from. They talk about malaria. They talk about a drinking bout with his buddies. They got a little bit too heavy on him. Some say he was poisoned. When I read the accounts, it sounds to me like poison, but who knows how he died. Now let me just read this about his body. It is known that he was mummified and that his body was put on display in Egypt at Memphis. Then the body was moved to Alexandria and put into a kind of burial sepulcher where you could still see the mummified body. According to Roman historians, it was still there when the Roman Emperor Augustus came to Egypt to pay his respects after his own conquest of Egypt in 30 BC. Some people believe that the actual burial site is currently underwater off the coast of Alexandria. That's probably where he is. Nobody's ever going to find Alexander. When he died, he left no instructions about his succession. He was a young man. He probably hadn't thought about it. But then again, if you're going to be a king, you probably should think about it right away. Who's going to take over if something happens to you? He hadn't really done that. So what happened was in summary, he had a brother who was mentally insufficient. He could not be king. He had 2 wives that were pregnant at the time he died. One was murdered before she gave birth. The other, they decided, okay, we're going to wait till this one gives birth and see if it's a boy or a girl. Turned out to be a boy. His name was, well, she named him Alexander as well, Alexander the Fourth. So what they decided to do was they let the brother, who was mentally incompetent, be the king. He was named king, but there was a regent who did all the work, and his name was Perdiccas. And he had a lot of ambitions to take over Alexander's role, but that was not going to happen because of these 4 generals we're going to talk about who didn't want him in there. Olympias, his mother, we talked about his mother. She went up to Albania, raised an army, and came down to try to protect the little child's life. And she fought against the army of Cassander, whom we're going to talk about here in a minute. And Cassander then defeated the army of Olympias, had Roxanne, the mother of Alexander, and Alexander executed. Alexander the child executed. He was 14 by that time. He also ordered the execution of Olympias, but the soldiers refused to kill her. But she still died under pretty dramatic circumstances. All right. As I was studying Alexander, I was noting things about him that really interested me, and so I'm going to start going through this list. I'm sorry I have to read these, but we don't want a silence on the line for the archives. And so, he believed himself to be the son of Zeus Ammon. Zeus Ammon, remember, was the prophetic deity in Egypt. He was a king soldier. He didn't send his men into battle. He took his men into battle. He was always at the head of his army. If they were going over a wall, Alexander was the first man over the wall. The guy was crazy. I mean, he had no concern for his own safety. He went over the wall first, but several times he was seriously wounded. He took an arrow in the neck, an arrow in the leg, a sword blow to the shoulder. He was seriously wounded, and whenever that happened, everything stopped. And for like 3 months or 4 months, however long it took him to heal, his whole army just sat around while he healed. And then again they went, because he wouldn't send his army if he couldn't lead them. All right, so led his men fearlessly, recklessly across deserts of ice or of sand. He was an exceptional administrator of military campaigns, of provisions, of management, of lines of communication. I'll be back to that lesson in a second. One writer has said that before Alexander, warfare resembled a street fight. After Alexander, it was more closely like a stage production, organized. He had engineers who built all kinds of machines, the siege machines and the catapults and that sort of thing that the world had never seen to that point. He had naval forces and architects and shipbuilders. And they all, when they got close to a coastline and they wanted to go farther, they all just went down to the coast and built ships and went on. It was really incredible how he did this. He designed and built cities. One story they tell about the cities, most of the cities, by the way, or many of them, he gave him his own name, Alexandria or Alexander something. Alexandria in Egypt, he is said to have designed it by taking birdseed and going out in the fields and just dropping bird seeds around and showing where he wanted the city, how he wanted the city to be organized. And then the birds came and ate the bird seed. So he consulted his seers about what did that mean. And the ones who wanted to please him said, well, that means that all the world's going to come to Alexandria. It's going to be a popular place. And those who didn't care if they pleased him said, well, this just means Alexandria is going to be destroyed. Alexandria is going to be destroyed. I guess the first ones were right because Alexandria became quite a large city, popular city, and I guess it still is. Is that true? Alexandria in Egypt? Okay. One of the cities I told you there on the edge, clear over there by India, was named Bucephala. Wait, did I talk about that? Yeah. Bucephala, after his horse, Bucephalus. That horse went with him all the way over to the end of his battles in India, was always faithful to him, was wounded several times, his horse was. But he took care of that horse. This horse was a horse that when he was 16, nobody could tame, this way the story goes. Nobody could tame this horse, but Alexander's 16-year-olds walked up to this horse and takes his head in his hands and talks to him, and then gets on and rides him away. And that's what the story says. But anyway, that was his horse, and it was his favorite horse, and it bothered him a lot when he lost that horse. Okay, we're going back to notes about Alexander. He was capable of massacring civil populations by the thousands and weeping for 3 days at the death of a companion. And when that companion died, he had the doctor crucified because he thought the doctor hadn't taken good enough care of him. He refused to allow his men to take spoils when the city surrendered without a fight. He was a politician of rare clarity of mind, had a kind of infantile belief in omens and augury, in soothsayers and astrologists, polytheist, we saw that. He was capable of shamelessly dressing in the royal clothing of the Asian potentate before whom subjects were expected to prostrate themselves and worship him as a god. The farther east he got, the more he adopted the Eastern customs, and he wore these long Asian Persian robes. And he had people who came into his throne room, they had to walk on their hands and knees, and they had to hold out offerings like this, underhanded to him, as if he were a god. And his personality, the historians say, was changing little by little, and he was becoming harsher and harsher in his judgments. He was not exactly homosexual, this is my estimation, but he definitely preferred the company of men to women, or seemed to. He was married several times, didn't spend much time with his wives. He was a poet, a musician, a prolific reader of Homer, carried with him a copy of Iliad under his pillow. He was capable of discoursing with his tutor, Aristotle. He possessed a surprising intellectual curiosity. He wanted to know everything, everything. He respected artists, scholars, engineers, architects, playwrights, actors, magicians, organized games and competition for his troops, and he liked to drink, especially after a victory, but as I said, it didn't seem like he really needed a victory to go on a drinking binge. As he got older, he became more and more cynical, dangerous, more enamored with himself, more vain. He killed with a spear a companion who was criticizing him. They were arguing, and his companion was saying something that Alexander didn't like. And they got back and forth really heatedly, and finally Alexander pulled out a spear, and then he killed this man, and then was inconsolable for 3 days. When he found some of his appointees in different cities were siphoning off money for themselves, he killed them himself with a sword, had them brought in front of him, took out his sword, and killed them all. He took his men all the way across from Greece to northwestern India before his army, exhausted, refused to go farther. So here's what we want to get to. What about the Jews during this time? What was it like when Alexander came to Jerusalem? What did he do? What did he say? Well, as he came down the eastern Mediterranean area, they were having battles and beating people all the way down. And then he came into Jerusalem, and his officers expected that he would besiege the city, demand their surrender, and do the same thing he's always done everywhere else. But he didn't quite do that. Here's what Josephus said. I hope you can read that. When he had given the high priest his right hand, the high priest is thought to be Simon the Just, if that's important. The priest ran along by him, and he came into the city, and when he went into the temple, he offered sacrifice to God. That is, he had the priest offer a sacrifice for him, according to the high priest's direction, and magnificently treated both the high priest and the priests. Now, at this point, his officers and his companions were saying, "Why are you being so easy on these people?" This is in Josephus a little bit earlier than the passage I'm showing you. This is a Josephus passage. And Josephus said, that Alexander said, "When I was in Greece, before we started any of this, I had a dream. And I saw a man dressed like this man, calling himself the high priest, is dressed." Remember how Richard last week showed us the dress of that was last week, wasn't it? Showed us the dress of the high priest, how impressive that is. He said, "I saw a man like this in my dream. And that man told me, you will be the ruler of the world. You will conquer Persia. So I'm not going to, here's the guy that I saw in my dream. I'm not going to attack him. I'm going to be easy on him." And he was. Now we get back to our text. When the book, see where am I now? And when the book of Daniel was showed him, Watch out now. When the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended. And of course, the priests probably told him, yes, you are the one. And as he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude for the present. But the next day he called them to him and bade them ask what favors they pleased of him. Whereupon the high priest desired that they might enjoy the laws of the forefathers and might pay no tribute on the 7th year. He granted all they desired, and when they entreated them that he would permit the Jews in Babylon and Media to enjoy their own laws also, he willingly promised to do hereafter what they desired. And when he said to the multitude that if any of them would enlist themselves in his army on this condition, that they should continue under the laws of their forefathers and live according to them, he was willing to take them with him. Many were ready to accompany him in his wars. So let me read something about that. From the time of his visit to Jerusalem, Alexander employed Jews in his army and gave them equal rights with the Greeks. Thus, the strong Hellenistic spirit of the Jews was created, which marked so large a portion of the nation in the subsequent periods of their history. Now, these priests had shown Alexander what Daniel had said about him. So they showed him these passages most likely. The one in Daniel 8, 20:21 and 6-8, where it says the ram could not stand up against the king of Greece, the great goat. And then it says at the end of that last passage, the goat became exceedingly great. So this was prophesied by Daniel, the power that Alexander was going to have against Persia. Surely they showed him those passages. Did they show him the rest? When he was strong, the great horn was broken. Did they show him, as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven? It's not certain, but I have an idea they didn't show him that part. At least it's not recorded that they did. At any rate, he was the goat. He was the first king of Greece that was prophesied by Daniel, and he was doing exactly what Daniel had said he would. Okay. Now, I couldn't resist comparing Alexander to Jesus. Even though this has nothing to do with his particular period of the Jews, this is the sort of stuff that just came up as I was studying this. And so again, I'm going to have to read it, but and I know you can read, but it needs to be read for the online. Alexander said a God was his father. Jesus declared God was his father. Alexander claimed to be a son of a God. Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. Alexander consulted oracles. Jesus prayed to his Father. Alexander was educated by Aristotle. Jesus had apparently no advanced education. Alexander gave himself wholly to his cause. So did Jesus. Gave himself wholly to his cause. Alexander surrounded himself with an inner circle. So did Jesus. Peter, James, and John. Alexander required worship at the end of his reign. Jesus accepted worship, but he did not require it. Alexander could not rule over nature. Jesus commanded nature. Alexander did no miracles. Jesus did undisputed miracles. Alexander sent men on special missions ahead of him in his campaign. So did Jesus. He sent men on special missions. Alexander wept over the death of a close friend. Jesus wept over the death of a close friend. The close friend for Alexander, he'd killed him himself, and then he wept over it. And also the other guy that died and then he crucified the doctor, he wept over that man too. But Jesus wept over the death of a close friend whose name was Lazarus. Alexander was a brutal warrior. Jesus preached love. Alexander killed many. Jesus gave life to many. Alexander was called the King of Kings. Jesus was called the King of Kings. Alexander accumulated kingdoms. Jesus said his kingdom was not of this world. Alexander established a worldly kingdom. Jesus established a spiritual kingdom. Both died at a young age. Alexander died seeking his own glory. Jesus died to glorify God. Alexander died for himself, for his own glory. Jesus died to himself. Alexander died to dominate people. Jesus died to liberate people. Alexander was not resurrected. Jesus was. Alexander is not coming back. Jesus is coming back. Cartledge says that Alexander had a huge impact on world history. Of course, we know that. He describes it. The king of Macedon, that's Alexander he's talking about, built an empire that covered more than 2 million square miles, an empire that stretched from Greece and Egypt to the Indian subcontinent, and forever changed the ancient world by ushering in a new Hellenistic epoch of Greek culture and influence. I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs too. The Western world, for better or for worse, became almost a single place. Remember the ones a while ago. United by a common culture that left its mark on language, literature, and politics. Alexander extended the boundaries of European civilization as far as India and left behind a definite impact on the history, art, and religion of the areas he conquered, including, of course, Jerusalem and Judea. Alexander sparked what is known as the Hellenistic period. The men in his army, families, historians, philosophers, poets, scientists, and others traveling with Alexander carried their Western customs with them, and he made sure to place Greek and Macedonian people in charge of his conquests along the way. As a result, Western culture mixed with Eastern culture to create a new culture throughout Alexander's empire. So with the Greek language and culture, what's happening here is that God is preparing the world to understand the message of the Messiah who's going to come. And when the Romans come in and take over the Greeks, they're going to set up roads in Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And that's going to prepare the world to spread out the word of the Messiah. So all of this is working in, you see, God is working in history. He's getting things ready. He's getting things ready for what Paul calls the fullness of time. The fullness of time in those two passages. So I guess maybe a lesson for us here is when things are going badly and we don't know what's going on, we do know that God's working. And we know that he has a plan. And we know that that plan is going to turn out for good for those who love him. That's what Paul says to the Romans. I hesitated to show you this because it's so small I couldn't get it any bigger. But this is Acts chapter 2, which talks about all the places that all these people came from in Acts chapter 2 at Pentecost. When the day of Pentecost was come and the apostles were preaching, filled with the Spirit, the people that were hearing them were from all over the place. And that was Alexander's doing. Getting people, Jewish people all over the world, and then they came together, a lot of them did, on Pentecost and heard the first gospel sermon, and many of them became Christians. So the work of Alexander was done. God had used him to essentially unify the world, but there was much more to come before the Messiah could appear. So let's just start into the next section, which is the Ptolemaic Seleucid period. Question in the back. Do we have a microphone? And another. Okay.
Comment about the city of Tyre. You read starting in Ezekiel chapter 26. Nebuchadnezzar tries to conquer Tyre. It doesn't work.
Right.
You go through it. God said, okay, you can have Egypt. Because when he broke through the wall, the people had moved from land to the island.
Right.
So he couldn't go get them. Well, along comes this guy a couple hundred years later that says, well, you know what? Let's just start picking up everything off the ground and start tossing it into the sea. Builds a causeway out to Tyre and destroys it. I don't know if you were going to cover that, but
I'm not going to cover that. I did look at it,
Tyre.
decided not to talk about it, but the story of how Alexander conquered Tyre is really fascinating. Built that ramp out there. Took him a while, but I mean, it couldn't be done. You know, they said it couldn't be done. He did it.
He did it.
He did it. If things couldn't be done, Alexander could.
Now, one of the things about it says in there in Ezekiel 26 about the spreading of nets, and if people go to that area, that's what it is, bare rock.
Yeah.
And fishermen spread their nets to dry them out after the day of fishing.
Very good. Thank you for that comment. Now we got one over in left field. That's your right field, though.
Thanks. A couple of things. Well, you were going through the comparison of Alexander and Jesus. Rebecca said you got the goat and the lamb. That's another interesting comparison.
That's very good. The goat
And
and the lamb.
Also, I was looking up, okay, to me, the map is shifted to the east when we talk about Alexander compared to like the Roman Empire. So I was also curious what's going on a little further west. And I think you kind of have the Carthaginians are at a high water mark at this time as well. And the Romans are still a republic, right?
Yeah.
So there's still plenty going on to the west as well, but it's like he's, like you said, mingling east and west.
Rome is definitely rising during this time. I haven't talked about him a lot, but I'm going to a little bit. But you're right. Yeah, there's definitely a lot going on that we're not going to talk about. Okay, let's see what time we got. 10 minutes. Now, this period essentially fits within the Greek period because we're going to talk about some generals of Alexander's who took over after he died. Here are some four subjects that we're going to try to hit also while we're in this period. We're going to talk about those four generals, then we'll talk briefly about the Septuagint, although Mike covered that in his class, the Sanhedrin, the development of the Sanhedrin, and then this guy whose name is Antiochus IV. Now, there were several contenders to take the place of Alexander, all by themselves. I mean, there were several guys who wanted to be the one who took over. But that wasn't going to happen. A lot of infighting, and finally his kingdom was divided among these four men. Ptolemy, who went down to Egypt. Now this is the king of the south in Daniel's prophecies. Him and his descendants, the kings of the south. Seleucus then is, and his descendants, the kings of the north. He had Syria in that area. We'll see a map here in a minute. And then Cassander, who was up in the northwest, and then Lysimachus, I forget where he was, but Cassander is the one who seemed to create the most problems for Alexander's actual family. But these other two guys on the left are the ones who are going to be the problem for the Jews. They're going to be a big problem for the Jews. In the beginning, Seleucus was supposed to take over Syria and the Jewish area, the Judea. But before he could get in there to kind of set up his house, Ptolemy moved in with his armies and he took over Judea. And so these two guys for the next 100 years-ish fought back and forth, them and their descendants, fought back and forth. And Judea, during that time, changed hands about 5 times. I mean, there was always an army coming in, fighting the other one, and they took over, and then this guy came back, and they fought, and then they took over. It was back and forth for a long time, and that had to be a really bad period for the Jews. Josephus said, the Jews were like a ship in a storm. They were tossed by the waves on both sides. It became a battlefield and the prize of victory for opposing powers. Somebody else says that Palestine was the debatable land, the bone of contention between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. So that's going to be important when we see what happens later on. So when Ptolemy I then came in and took over, there's the split up of the kingdoms. I've always wondered why Lysimachus and Cassander had relatively small kingdoms, and this guy Seleucus got all that area out there. Maybe because it was hard to handle and keep a handle on it. I don't know, but anyway, it was Seleucus and Ptolemy who fought back and forth, and you see Judea right between them, on the eastern Mediterranean, there. So when there's another map of that area that was fought over by those two guys. When Ptolemy I came in to Jerusalem, when he wasn't supposed to, it was already assigned to Seleucus, he seized upon Jerusalem, and for that end made use of deceit and treachery. For he came into the city on a Sabbath day, as if he would offer sacrifice. He, without any trouble, gained the city, while the Jews did not oppose him, for they did not suspect him to be their enemy. And he gained it thus, because they were free from suspicion of him, because on that day they were at rest and quietness. And when he had gained it, he reigned over it in a cruel manner. And when Ptolemy had taken a great many captives, he led them all into Egypt and settled them there. Settled is not really the right word. Most of them were either slaves or conscripted into his armies. One writer says that there were 100,000 Jews taken from Judah on this occasion into Egypt. Okay, we're going to stop there for now. Dave, where are you? Dave, could you put people on for the next 5 minutes? Because I don't want to get into more Ptolemaic rulers, and we'll stop there. Something else entirely. The Bible is not immune to good-looking people. I mean, the writers of the Bible don't mind telling you if somebody was good-looking. I found that interesting. And if we can get it up. Here we go. Now, good-looking people in the Bible. I looked on the net and said, okay, give me a picture of a man and a woman who are good-looking, and here's what I got. That's probably not the good-looking people in the Bible. It would probably be more like this and like this, probably. All right, so let's talk about some of the people that the Bible says were good-looking. We have to do it quickly, though. Sarah, wife of Abraham, was a woman, beautiful in appearance, very beautiful. Rebecca, very attractive. Rachel, beautiful in form and appearance. You know what that means. Joseph, handsome in form and appearance. Saul, son of Kish, king of Israel, a handsome young man, not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. That might have been part of why he was picked. David, ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. Ruddy, that's kind of like red hairish, isn't it? I was going to look up ruddy. What's ruddy mean? Reddish. Okay, that's right. Abigail, wife of Nabal, then of David, discerning and beautiful. Bathsheba, wife of Uriah the Hittite, then David, very beautiful. Absalom, now listen to this, long description. In Israel there was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. Wow. And now you know how he ended up too. That didn't help him end up well. Tamar, daughter of David, was beautiful. Tamar, daughter of Absalom, was a beautiful woman. Abishag, the Shunammite, boy, she caused a lot of problems between the two of the sons of David. A beautiful young woman, very beautiful. Adonijah, the son of David, that's the one who wanted Abishag as his wife, created some problems. He was a very handsome man. Esther, queen of Persia, the young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And then I think these are the last ones. The daughters of Job were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters. An Egypt warrior who was killed by Benaiah, and that was Solomon's hitman, Benaiah. He was a handsome man. And then Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those guys. Youth without blemish and of good appearance. I thought you might consider that interesting to see the beautiful people of the Bible. There were quite a few. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. See you later.